Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe now to get the latest ancient history news and independent research from around the world. The earliest radiocarbon date from Göbekli Tepe is around 11,600 years ago, which is thought to be when people first arrived at this hilltop site in Ancient Anatolia, and when the first enclosures were built. The date is very intriguing to many, because 11,600 years ago is also the time when the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe came to an end, which, for those that don't know, was a period of global cooling that lasted for around 1,300 years. Temperatures returned parts of Europe and North America to Ice Age conditions. During the Younger Dryas and Ancient Anatolia, conditions turned cold, very dry and arid, with lake levels dropping dramatically, sometimes by as much as 260 metres, with water also turning more saline. It was a harsh world, a landscape with few trees, and also totally unfit for agriculture, and people would have hunted and gathered for food. Before people ask, there is no evidence for any kind of great flood in this part of the world at this time. In fact, studies show that the onset of the Younger Dryas didn't change things overnight. By looking at pollen, studies show it took several hundred years for Anatolia to turn more arid, which gave people time to evolve their diets and practices with the changing climate and landscape. Even at the end of the Younger Dryas, even when the rain returned, it took many hundreds of years for woodland expansion to really take hold. Due to the return of the wet winter period though, the start of the Holocene saw lake levels dramatically rise, pistachia shrubs becoming more abundant across the landscape, more so than trees, and wild grasses, plants and crops covered the land. So, is it a coincidence that the origins of the enormous megalithic site of Gobekli Tepe coincides with the end of the Younger Dryas, when temperatures rose sharply and eventually reached modern levels? How did these hunter-gatherer communities have the technical know-how to create such a site? Such enormous and well-carved pillars of stone, such fantastic vessels and statues, and so on? These are questions asked by many, from archaeologists to independent researchers. Some believe the answer is still waiting to be discovered. Others believe the survivors of a lost ancient civilization, wiped out during the Younger Dryas, came to Anatolia and taught the indigenous primitive hunter-gatherers their more advanced knowledge and technologies. They were taught how to quarry stone and then build impressive enclosures, and then they were taught how to domesticate crops and livestock. To me though, the answer is far less sensational, and the structures of Göbekli Tepe are not as mysterious as many make out. When we combine the archaeological discoveries across the region with the analysis of DNA that's been done, together with the climate data for the region, and once we clear up a few misconceptions, hopefully what I'm saying in this video will make a lot of sense. The biggest error that people make in the survivors of a lost ancient civilization hypothesis is looking at Göbekli Tepe in isolation, making out it's some kind of magical miracle. When we do that, of course it does look too amazing and too impossible for any conventional explanation. In isolation, it looks like 11,600 years ago, just as the Younger Dryas comes to an end, large multi-ton T-shaped pillars appear out of nowhere, in a landscape that is occupied by hunter-gatherers and far away from a natural source of water. As well as the intricately carved T-shaped pillars, we also find a huge amount of finely cut and carved stone vessels and statues. There are clear and obvious signs of an organised society, belief and culture. Who were these people? Where did they come from? How did they become so advanced so quickly? But that's an isolated view of Göbekli Tepe, and a picture that people do often paint, and such a view does allow for the idea of mysterious teachers, survivors of a lost ancient civilization, imparting their knowledge to an indigenous population. But Göbekli Tepe is not an isolated site, not in the slightest, and this has been known for decades. it's not hard to find out. It's one of dozens of pre-pottery Neolithic sites in the region, and it's certainly not the oldest. In the nearby Levant, we find early Natufian permanent settlements from the 13th millennium BC. In Anatolia, settlements in the Tigris Basin have origins long before the first pillar was erected at Göbekli Tepe. When we look at these older sites, we soon realise that Gobekli Tepe was not some magical innovation at the end of the Younger Dryas, but more like the culmination of skills, technologies, practices and techniques that had been evolving for many hundreds of years, all of which belong to the indigenous people of ancient Anatolia, not some lost ancient civilization. And this view is also backed up with DNA evidence. In Nature in 2019, a study was published titled "Late Pleistocene Human Genome Suggests a Local Origin for the First Farmers of Central Anatolia." The genome-wide study looks at prehistoric humans, including the first Epi-Paleolithic Anatolian hunter-gatherer sequence to date, dating back to between 15,642 and 15,073 years ago. Early pre-pottery Neolithic Anatolian farmers were sequenced as well, dating back to between 10,300 and 9,800 years ago, as well as pre-pottery Neolithic farmers in the Levant, dating to 9,700 to 9,600 years ago. Scientists were able to chart the genetic record from the Epi-Paleolithic to the early Holocene. And what did they discover? They noted there was a high genetic continuity between the hunter-gatherers and early farmers, with two distinct incoming ancestries, an early one related to the Iran-Caucasus region, and then a later one that's linked to the Levant. What this is telling us is that the local hunter-gatherers did become the first farmers, and from 15,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, the people of Anatolia, separated by 5,000 years, did share 90% genetics. Pre-pottery Neolithic farmers inherited about 10% of their genes from a gene pool related to the Neolithic Iran and Caucasus region. So unless there is a lost ancient civilization around this area, we can probably assume that the people of Göbekli Tepe, and also the first Anatolian farmers, were people that were native to the region. And this does make sense when we look at the archaeology. Göbekli Tepe is one of many sites in the region, and to me, I think we can see a clear evolution in building techniques, not some overnight revolution. Radiocarbon dating shows that the settlement known as Kortik Tepe has origins dating back to around 12,400 to 12,200 years ago, meaning that activity began during the Younger Dryas, and the site shows continuous occupation and also clear development and evolution for the hundreds of years that followed. Here we find finely carved and decorated stone artefacts and vessels, beautiful beaded jewellery, circular enclosures, ritualistic behaviour, and evidence that people did believe in an afterlife. Although the artefacts, vessels and tools are just as amazing as anything at Gobekli Tepe, the early pre-pottery Neolithic enclosures are not as beautiful, and also not as well constructed. But these are earlier, and they are clearly a precursor, an earlier stage of evolution of the pre-pottery Neolithic construction techniques. By looking at Kortik Tepe, Göbekli Tepe is already looking less of a miracle, and even more so when we consider Bonkuklu Tala in modern Turkey. This site is thought to have had continuous settlement from the Epi-Paleolithic all the way through to the pre-pottery Neolithic B, again with origins predating Göbekli Tepe. Nearly 30 houses have been excavated, 6 public structures, silos for storing wild cereals and grain, more than 100,000 beads have been discovered, as well as a possible temple that's older than anything found at Gobekli Tepe. This site did not emerge after the Younger Dryas, it shows continuous habitation through this period. some enclosures have central monolithic stones, as well as pillars that are made up of numerous rocks. It looks like an early stage in the development of structural building in ancient Anatolia. Just look at this selection of finds, and yes, made by people that hunted and gathered, as there is no evidence of domesticated grains, cereals or animal bones. At the end of the Younger Dryas, there was no overnight transformation in Anatolia. In fact, we see clear evidence of a gradual evolution over many hundreds of years. Then you have Göbekli, a long-term settlement in the pre-pottery Neolithic, with radiocarbon dates going back to at least 11,800 years ago, and thought by some to have even earlier origins due to the similarities to Göbekli Tepe, Gobekli Tepe and also Semkahoyuk. As the archaeologists excavated the site layer by layer, Göbekli showed us the incredible evolution of structural building, with an early building made of small stones covering what looks like a pit. Then we get a later and larger circular building, and this has wooden posts at regular intervals along the perimeter wall, likely supporting a wooden superstructure. These are an obvious precursor to the stone T-shaped pillars in the walls of Gobekli Tepe. Near the centre of the same enclosure is a 1.5 metre high flat stone pillar, again similar to the central pillars of Gobekli Tepe enclosures, and also likely to support a roof. At Göbekli, there are 4 more phases of building, each of which shows the evolving skills of a people living at a site with origins older than Gobekli Tepe, and starting life during the Younger Dryas. In later phases we see new enclosures with benches around the edge, just like we see at Gobekli Tepe, and there is also an enclosure with 4 standing pillars inside, just like the Lion's Pillar building at Gobekli Tepe. The artefacts are just as breathtaking as anything found at Gobekli Tepe, arguably even more so, with large grinding bowls, pestles shaped with animal heads, decorated stone vessels, and astonishing stone beads that are actually inlaid with serpentine. There are also more sites I could mention in Anatolia, even more in the Levant, showing continuous occupation and even expansion through the Younger Dryas. There was no sudden overnight change from primitive hunter-gatherers to megalithic builders. There was a clear and gradual evolution in structural and building techniques over many hundreds of years. So, with all that in mind, how do we explain the origins of Gobekli Tepe, if sites like Göbekli Tepe, Gobekli Tepe and Göbekli all showed continuous settlement throughout the Younger Dryas? Why did Gobekli Tepe start life 11,600 years ago and not before? Well, it must all be to do with the climate, and I believe we can find the answer when studying the Natufian culture of the Levant. During the Younger Dryas, studies showed that settled Natufian communities became more mobile, leaving their settlements behind and living a more traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle, likely to ensure their own survival as the climate got worse. But as conditions improved at the end of the Younger Dryas, we can see in the archaeology that they did begin to resettle. Some people may have even migrated to Anatolia, as DNA evidence seems to imply. We already know from the archaeological record that the Natufian people already had the skills and knowledge to build with stone and to finely carve and decorate stone objects. So, the new Holocene settlements that emerged in the Levant were not some kind of miraculous innovation. It was knowledge the culture already had and likely passed down from generation to generation. The same likely happened in Anatolia as well. We know that during the Younger Dryas, there were well-established settlements, and these continued as the climate became worse and worse, but also came out the other side. But it's very likely that some of the people living in these settlements decided to live a more mobile lifestyle as conditions became more arid. Maybe food was becoming scarce, and there simply wasn't enough to feed all the people. It's also possible that some settlements, yet to be discovered by archaeologists, were completely abandoned, as people had to become more mobile in the landscape, again for survival. But as the Younger Dryas came to an end, as the rain returned and shrubs, plants and grasses grew, these mobile communities settled down once again, a people with a history, heritage and full knowledge of building settlements from stone and wood, and knowing how to finely carve and decorate stone objects. Göbekli Tepe was a major new settlement created by a hunter-gatherer community, but as Kortik Tepe and Gusir Hoyuk show, they were people from a wider culture who already knew full well how to work stone to a high level. They trapped the heavy rains by cutting stone basins into the bedrock, channeling the surface runoff into them. They made their new settlements close to rocky limestone outcrops, having good access to building stone, and I assume the chosen site for Göbekli Tepe would have been close to wild grasses and crops, as well as being a prime location for hunting. There are claims that agriculture started at the exact moment that Göbekli Tepe was built, but of course there is no evidence the people of Göbekli Tepe domesticated any crops or animals at all, with only wild cereals and wild animal bones found in the hundreds of years of excavated archaeology. The advent of agriculture is not related to the building of Göbekli Tepe and is a far more complex line of study over a much wider geographic area. I'll do a separate video on the advent of agriculture in the near future. In my opinion and in my research, Göbekli Tepe was not a miracle as some people make out, and to me, it really isn't any kind of evidence for a lost ancient civilization teaching a more primitive people. It was the culmination of hundreds or thousands of years of evolution and innovation by a local culture that already knew how to build and work stone, a culture that had been living in this region for generations, but had no option but to return to a mobile lifestyle as climatic conditions worsened in the Younger Dryas. Of course, this is just a short video, it's not an in-depth PhD thesis, and of course it does raise many questions. Who were the people from the Iran-Caucasus region that mixed with the natives? What were the people of Anatolia doing before sites like Kortik Tepe and Gusir Hoyuk? We can all hypothesise, but we can only really use the data that's available. The archaeological record gets more incomplete the further we go back in time, but new discoveries are being made all the time, and the more we discover, the more we learn. But we do know that building technologies have evolved for millennia. It's just that the climate and materials have changed. And in my opinion, the climate is the main driver for the evolution of human civilization. 25,000 years ago during the Ice Age in Siberia, and 15,000 years ago in parts of Eastern Europe, hunter-gatherers were constructing incredibly well-planned and well-engineered buildings from the bones of mammoths. When you look at how they were made, they really were astonishing structures, not primitive buildings made by a primitive people who were stacking bones in some random fashion. I think sometimes we can underestimate the capabilities of our ancestors. People have been capable of construction projects for thousands of years. They've been creating wonderful works of art for millennia, and they've been making intricate stone and bone objects for tens of thousands of years. But I believe that human development and civilization was always prevented by Ice Age conditions. The climate really does drive human development. The climate change at the end of the Younger Dryas meant that humans could finally thrive, and all the skills they had learned and passed down from generation to generation came together. They were now able to build stable settlements in a stable climate and landscape, and in time they did develop agriculture. And then, as they say, the rest is history. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.